It wasn't just a photograph. There was no blood, there was no weapon, there was no crime scene, and yet it ended everything. The image appeared on screen for less than a second. A hallway backstage, dim lighting. Two figures too close, an arm resting naturally on another man's shoulder. A gesture so ordinary that on any other day it would have vanished without a trace. But that was not just any day. In a matter of hours, the photograph spread across screens like an infection. Cropped, zoomed, annotated, interpreted. The internet didn't ask what had happened, it decided what it meant, and the meaning, once assigned, became a verdict. The man in the photograph had spent decades building an image of composure and restraint. He was known for his discipline, for his distance, for knowing exactly where to stand and when to disappear. That night, he had hosted an award ceremony under blinding lights, delivering rehearsed wit with impeccable precision. The applause accompanied him as he left the stage. The approval still floated in the air. Then the photograph appeared. Suddenly, the applause transformed into whispers. The whispers hardened into accusations. The accusations turned into demands. How could he be next to someone linked, even distantly, to a death that still haunted the industry? How could he smile when another man had vanished from this world, under circumstances that no one dared to clarify, no explanation was asked for, and none would have mattered? We have learned something disturbing about public judgment. It no longer needs proof. Proximity is enough. Silence becomes a confession. Neutrality is interpreted as betrayal, and context is discarded as an excuse invented by the guilty. Behind the screens, contracts stopped. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Invitations were withdrawn in silence, not through confrontation, but through absence. Messages went unanswered. Names disappeared from calendars without any ceremony. No one announced a ban, it simply happened. This is how careers end now, not with a proven scandal, but with an insinuated suspicion. The man in the center of the storm understood it instinctively. He had seen it happen before. He remembered another artist. Younger, brighter, less protected. A rising star whose laughter filled rehearsal rooms, whose name promised permanence. That name was now only spoken in fragments, in low voices, in unfinished sentences. Officially, there had been no crime, only an unexplained, unresolved death. And yet, everyone acted as if the guilt had dispersed into the very air, clinging to anyone who breathed too close. We tell ourselves that this is accountability, that public outrage is justice, but justice does not operate on instinct, it does not punish association, and it does not demand silence as proof of virtue. That night, alone in a hotel room overlooking a city that never fully sleeps, the man looked at his phone. He issued no statement, he did not defend himself. He knew too much because the photograph was not the beginning, it was only the echo. The fallen star didn't start as a warning, he started as an answer. He arrived in the industry with that kind of talent that silences a room. Directors noticed him. Brands wanted his face. Fans learned the rhythm of his voice. The story, at least on the surface, was known. A young man stepping into a light that seemed destined for him. But we must be careful with the word destiny. In this world, success does not always mean freedom. Sometimes it means ownership. There were contracts he didn't fully understand, signed in rooms that smelled faintly of cologne and printer ink. Clauses that sounded harmless when read aloud. Expenses, fees, management costs, deductions for publicity. A system designed so that everything was measurable, except the only thing that truly mattered. Control. At first, he accepted it, most do. The first lesson any artist learns is that gratitude is mandatory. You don't complain when doors open. You don't ask what the price is until after you have paid it. Then came the betrayal. Not in the form of violence, but as a favor. It came from someone he trusted, a familiar voice, someone with whom he had shared meals, rehearsals, long nights, someone who had been close enough to be mistaken for family. The request was simple, delivered with urgency and a rehearsed tremor. A private crisis, a short-term loan, a promise of quick repayment. The fallen star hesitated. He wasn't reckless. He had learned to be cautious with strangers, but this wasn't a stranger. It was a name from the inner circle spoken without suspicion. Someone who knew how to frame desperation as sincerity. So he accepted. The money moved in silence, not in headlines, not in press releases, just numbers sliding from one account to another as if the transfer could remain invisible. It wasn't a fortune by industry standards, but it was enough to matter, enough to represent years of work, nights of exhaustion, performances done while sick, obligations fulfilled without complaint. Then the person disappeared. Not physically, not yet. Disappearance in modern life usually begins with silence. Calls that go straight to voicemail. Messages seen and unanswered. Responses delayed until the urgency dies of starvation. The fallen star tried to stay calm. He told himself there must be complications. He told himself he was exaggerating. He told himself that this is what loyalty looks like when tested. But when weeks turned into months, reality took shape. Sharp, undeniable. The crisis had been manufactured. He began to notice details that knotted his stomach. The same person who alleged desperation was now wearing expensive watches, driving a new car, posting from restaurants where a single bill could have paid an entire family's monthly rent. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was obscene. That is the moment when betrayal stops being just personal. It becomes humiliating because betrayal is not solely the theft of money, it is the theft of dignity. It is the unspoken message that your trust was predictable, that your kindness was a weakness designed to be exploited. He demanded repayment. The response was not regret, it was hostility. Suddenly, the friend became a negotiator. A legal voice entered the conversation. The language shifted from personal to procedural. He was no longer speaking to someone he loved, he was speaking to a wall built of technicalities. If you have never experienced this type of betrayal, you might imagine it as a clean cut. A simple realization, a decision to sever ties. It is not clean, it is slow and corrosive. It infiltrates the body. Sleep becomes light. Food loses flavor. The mind begins to replay conversations, looking for the moment you didn't see. It is a private investigation without proof because the only evidence was your own memory, and memory can be rewritten by regret. The fallen star began to crumble in small ways. At first, he would arrive early to rehearsals and sit alone, staring at nothing. He missed cues he had never missed before. He forgot lyrics he had performed hundreds of times. When they asked if he was okay, he smiled and said he was tired. The word tired became an umbrella large enough to hide everything. But tiredness doesn't explain the deeper change. His world began to feel like a sealed container, calm on the surface, lethal underneath. He could feel the pressure building around him, not just from the betrayal itself, but from what it implied. If someone so close could steal from him without consequences, what else was happening behind his back? What else had been taken, redirected, withheld? He began to ask questions about his finances. The answers were vague. He asked for figures. He received summaries. He requested breakdowns. He was told the details were complicated. He tried to schedule meetings. The meetings were postponed. He tried to speak directly to those making the decisions. The calls were diverted. And then he saw it, not as a sensation, but as a pattern. A portion of his income had never reached him. Money that should have been there was always explained away by deductions that sounded legitimate until they were added up. Every month, every project, every sponsorship, something was subtracted, and the subtraction was treated as normal. It is hard to describe what that does to a person. Imagine realizing that your life has been profitable for everyone except you. Imagine discovering that you have been living inside your own career like a guest in a house that belongs to someone else. That realization didn't anger him at first, it made him quiet. There is a particular kind of silence that precedes collapse. A silence so controlled that to others it looks like strength. He stopped complaining, he stopped trusting, he stopped speaking, because once you have been betrayed by someone you loved, even kindness begins to look like a trap. And that was when the strangest part began. He started receiving calls from numbers he didn't recognize. When he answered, there was nothing on the line, just a soft, steady sound like breathing, sometimes a faint click, as if someone were adjusting a device. When he hung up, the calls returned hours later, always silent, always patient. He told himself it was a coincidence, a glitch, an error. But the calls continued. Then came the message. It appeared late at night, a single line without a greeting or signature, without explanation. Just a phrase that felt less like a threat and more like a reminder. It read, "You should stop asking." He looked at it until the screen dimmed. We must stop here and recognize something. These types of warnings are often dismissed because they don't sound dramatic. There is no demand, no explicit violence, no theatrical promise of consequences, but precisely because of that, they are effective. They assume power, suggest proximity, imply that someone is already inside your life, watching closely enough to know what you are doing and calm enough to warn you without urgency. That night, the fallen star didn't call the police. He didn't tell his friends, he didn't post anything online. He did what people do when they feel that speaking will make the danger more real. He swallowed it. He lay in bed with his eyes open, listening to the building settle. The pipes creaking, distant traffic, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. Then, sometime after 3 a.m.,
No.
his phone rang again. He answered. This time, the line did not remain silent. A voice spoke low and close, as if the speaker's mouth were centimeters from the microphone. It said his name. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It arrived like frost. Quietly, patiently, indifferent to panic. After the call, the fallen star sat upright in bed with the phone still pressed to his ear. The line was already dead. No explanation, no breathing, no static, just the opaque certainty that someone had wanted him to hear a single thing. His name. He didn't tell anyone, not because he didn't trust anyone, but because he understood the price of confession. In this world, fear is treated as weakness. Weakness becomes a rumor, and rumor transforms into a knife that needs no hand to wield it. In the morning, he looked normal again. Clean clothes, neutral expression, a professional face capable of surviving scrutiny. Those who crossed paths with him in the hallways didn't see terror. They saw a man who had learned the oldest survival skill in the entertainment industry, performing with poise. What changed wasn't his schedule, it was his perimeter. He noticed it first in small absences. A friend who previously greeted him warmly now offered a polite nod and kept walking. A stylist who used to chat during fittings now concentrated on the fabric as if words were dangerous. A producer who used to call him directly began channeling communication through assistants as if proximity required authorization. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic break, only distance. We must not underestimate what that does to a person. A scandal doesn't need headlines to destroy you. Sometimes it only needs the silent agreement of everyone around you, each deciding that caution is safer than loyalty. The fallen star began to perceive that conversation stopped when he entered a room. He caught the last fragments of words, followed by a sudden void. People looked away. They smiled too quickly. They behaved like witnesses, afraid of being mistaken for accomplices. And he understood the rule. If you stand too close to the wrong story, The story stains you. Even so, he tried to reach out. Late at night, he sent messages to the people he trusted most. Simple lines. Are you free to talk? I need advice. Can we meet? Hours passed, then days. The responses arrived like formal condolences. Brief, careful, almost polite. I'm busy right now. Let's talk later. Take care. One message never arrived. From the friend he once called family, the friend with whom he had shared his first success and his worst exhaustion. The friend who had promised that no matter what happened, he would never leave. The silence from that number was more deafening than any threat. On set, he watched people choose survival in real time. A young actor lowered his voice and suggested they eat together after rehearsal. Then he looked around and changed the subject immediately. A crew member started laughing at something he said and stopped abruptly, as if remembering where laughter could lead. Even kindness became cautious. The fallen star began to understand that the industry didn't function like a community. It functioned like an aquarium. Transparent walls, beautiful light, and an invisible pressure that kept every creature moving exactly as expected. The pressure didn't come just from contracts. It came from fear, from the awareness that someone somewhere controlled what could be said, what could be insinuated, what could be remembered. He saw it again in the way people spoke of the dead. They didn't use names, they used euphemisms. They said, the deceased artist. They said, what happened? They said, that incident? When the fallen star asked directly, faces tightened, gazes averted. Someone would change the subject with a joke that failed to alleviate anything. No one wanted to carry the weight of the truth because the truth was radioactive. Even when it was just suspicion, suspicion was enough to poison a career. This is how a person becomes a ghost while still alive. He began to notice it in digital spaces as well. Old photographs disappeared from public accounts. Comments were deleted. Fan pages that previously praised him now posted ambiguous statements about disappointment and morality. People who had never met him wrote as if they understood his soul. And then the fallen star watched as the survivor was punished for a photograph, a casual hug, a shared frame, an instant in a hallway, and suddenly the survivor's name began to be carved into the same wall of suspicion. The fallen star understood the mechanism immediately. This wasn't about justice, it was about purification. A ritual executed by the crowd with social media as the altar. The crowd didn't need facts, it needed a symbol, and symbols are easy to destroy. It was then that the fallen star began to think of performance not as art, but as language. Before, he had believed that the truth could be told. Now he wondered if the truth could only be shown, hidden within the spectacle, smuggled through metaphors, buried in an image that would haunt those who knew how to read it. He remembered a show he had seen months earlier during a rehearsal. An experimental stage exit, a performer trapped behind transparent walls, pounding until he bled, the water changing color around him. At that moment, it had seemed like a dramatic device. Now, it felt like a confession. A person drowning in a public while everyone applauds. That was what artists trained to represent their own suffering had become, so the public could consume it without guilt. The fallen star sat alone in a dressing room, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd on the other side of the walls. That sound should have energized him. Instead, it felt like something hungry waiting to be fed. He opened his phone once more and looked again at the warning message. You should stop asking. He didn't delete it. He took a screenshot. Then, with a hesitation that lasted barely a breath, he opened the Notes app and wrote a single sentence. If I disappear, this is where it started. He saved it, locked his phone, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. Under the lights, his face looked calm, almost ordinary, but his eyes didn't match because he had finally understood the rule that governed it all. In this world, innocence doesn't protect you. Silence does. The system doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't speak in orders. It reveals itself slowly through repetition, through patterns that only become visible after something has already been lost. By the time the fallen star began to understand it, the damage was no longer reversible. He stopped asking questions, not because he no longer wanted answers, but because every question generated resistance. Requests for transparency were met with delays. Delays turned into cancellations. Cancellations transformed into warnings disguised as concern. You seem stressed. Maybe you should rest. This isn't the right time. The phrases were soft, almost affectionate. That was their power. The system doesn't threaten. It reassures. It convinces you that survival depends on obedience and that resistance is not brave, but irresponsible. It teaches you that silence is maturity and that endurance is professionalism. The fallen star watched his colleagues navigate this terrain with a learned ease. They knew when to speak and when to disappear. They knew which names could be mentioned and which must never be acknowledged. They knew how to seem empathetic without becoming associated. This knowledge was never written down. It was inherited. A veteran artist pulled him aside once after a rehearsal. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "You have talent," he told him. "Don't ruin it by asking questions to the wrong people." There was no malice in the warning, only experience. The fallen star understood then that the system didn't need executioners in dark rooms. It depended on internalization. People policed themselves, corrected each other in silence, learned to feel the boundaries without anyone pointing them out. This is how exploitation becomes invisible. Money kept flowing around him, but rarely toward him. His name generated value, but his access to that value remained conditional. Every project brought new deductions. Every explanation sounded reasonable in isolation. Only when he placed them side by side did the truth emerge. He was profitable, he was replaceable, and therefore, he was manageable. When he expressed concerns again, the response was swift and surgical. His schedule changed. Opportunities evaporated without explanation. Rumors began to circulate, not of misconduct, but of instability. He's difficult, he's emotional, he's not in a good place. The words were carefully chosen. They didn't accuse, they discredited. This is how the system neutralizes threats, not by destroying them openly, but by reshaping them until no one listens. The fallen star felt his world contracting, the rooms getting smaller, conversations briefer. Even his own thoughts began to feel watched, as if doubting was dangerous. At night, he dreamed of water. Not waves, not storms, still water, enclosed, pressing against transparent walls. In the dream, he could see people outside the tank. They watched him struggle. Some seemed concerned, others bored. None intervened. He would wake up with his heart racing, his hands clenched, as if he had been pounding on the glass. When he tried to explain this sensation to a therapist, the words abandoned him. How do you describe an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere? How do you explain that nothing illegal has happened, and yet everything feels wrong? There were no clear villains to point to, only roles. Representatives protecting themselves, brands avoiding risk, colleagues choosing safety, followers demanding moral clarity without accepting complexity. And then there was the public. The fallen star began to understand that the system didn't fear the truth, it feared confusion. As long as the public believed there were clear sides, heroes, and villains, the machinery could continue without interruptions. Nuance was dangerous, silence was rewarded. Now he saw it clearly. The moment someone died under ambiguous circumstances, the system closed ranks. Explanations were delayed. Narratives were molded. Responsibility dissolved into administrative language, and the public, hungry for certainty, accepted the first story that arrived. That is why the photograph mattered, not because it proved anything, but because it offered clarity. a simple image, a visible association, something the public could point to and say, "This is wrong." The system didn't create the outrage, it allowed it. It benefited from it. Because while the crowd argued about guilt, no one asked structural questions. No one examined contracts. No one demanded accountability from those who had designed the cage. The fallen star felt something settle inside him. A cold understanding. If he spoke openly, he would be erased. If he remained silent, perhaps he would survive. But survival no longer felt like a victory. He began to prepare in silence. Not to get revenge, not to expose anyone, but to disappear. He organized documents, backed up messages, noted dates and names in a private file that no one else knew existed. He told himself it was a precaution, but deep down, he knew it was something else. It was the recognition that the system didn't need him to stay alive to continue. It only needed him to remain quiet. The last time he walked past a mirror in a studio hallway, he barely recognized the man looking back at him from the reflection. The face was familiar, the posture professional, but something essential had been hollowed out. He rested the palm of his hand against the glass. For a brief instant, he imagined what it would be like to break through it, to shatter the surface, to breathe. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. A notification with no sender name, no preview text, just a reminder that the system was still watching. In this world, innocence doesn't protect you. Silence does. Morning brought no relief, it brought routine. The survivor moved through the day as if nothing had changed, because that was what the world demanded. He smiled when cameras appeared. He nodded at the right moments. He spoke with the same measured cadence that previously made him seem untouchable. But there are things routine cannot hide. A man doesn't lose his balance over a single photograph. He loses it because the photograph confirms something he has known for a long time. In this industry, reputation is not a reflection of the truth. It is a contract between strangers, and contracts can be dissolved without warning. Behind closed doors, the survivor watched the doors close. A brand partner delayed a meeting with polite excuses repeated too often to be sincere. A producer spoke in careful circles, neither denying support nor offering it. The kindest people didn't abandon him. They simply reduced their proximity until he became invisible. There was no trial, there was no formal accusation, just the sensation of having been sentenced. He began to understand the fallen star in a way he hadn't managed to before. He remembered how the young man had tried to laugh off the exhaustion, how he had minimized the isolation as a passing phase, how he had insisted everything was fine, because admitting otherwise would have been interpreted as failure. At that moment, the survivor had seen it as immaturity, as a lack of discipline, as a weakness that would vanish with experience. Now he recognized it as survival. The survivor opened his phone and reviewed old messages. He found fragments of interrupted conversations, plans that never materialized, apologies that were never explained. He looked at the fallen star's name on the screen, and for an instant, he felt the impulse to call, as if time could be reversed. But the dead do not answer. What remained was the silence that followed them. The careful forgetfulness of the industry, the polite refusal to speak a name too loudly, the way public mourning had been replaced by public judgment, as if every tragedy needed a culprit to feel complete. We tell ourselves we want the truth, but the truth is complex. It demands patience, it demands restraint, it demands the capacity to sustain uncertainty without turning it into a weapon. The crowd rarely offers that. Instead, it offers a simpler ritual. Identify a symbol, destroy it, declare the world safer, move on. The survivor looked at the photograph again. He studied details he had previously ignored. The angle, the lighting, the naturalness of the gesture, the way it had been captured without consent and then repurposed as proof of something no one could demonstrate. He understood with a cold clarity that he had become part of the same mechanism that had devoured the fallen star. Not out of guilt, but out of association, out of proximity, out of the collective need for moral clarity at any cost. His hands shook, not from fear of punishment, but from understanding what punishment really was. The punishment wasn't losing work. It wasn't losing money. It wasn't losing fame. The punishment was watching everyone learn the same lesson. Speak, and you risk everything. Remain silent, and perhaps you will be allowed to stay. He approached the window and looked out at the city. Towers of glass reflected a pale sky. Somewhere below, strangers lived their lives with the confidence of those who believed themselves free. The survivor didn't feel free. He felt like a man standing in front of a water tank, understanding at last that the glass wasn't a scenic element. It was a warning. And if the death of the fallen star had demonstrated anything, it wasn't that someone was guilty, it was that the system does not need guilt to destroy a person. It only needs a moment, a photograph, an echo. The question is not who will fall next. The question is, will anyone dare to speak when it happens again?